Previously on Deceitful Stories. Ella clutched her phone tightly, her knuckles white from the pressure. The weight of the evidence she carried felt like a ticking time bomb in her hands. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing the urgency of her mission. She had the video, the undeniable proof that could exonerate James and expose Mary and Mr. Richard for the liars they were. Victory was within reach, but she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Escaping the mansion unscathed. As she made her way down the grand staircase, the polished marble floors reflecting the dim light of the chandeliers, Ella couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The mansion, with its towering ceilings and labyrinthine hallways, felt like a prison closing in around her. She quickened her pace, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, but as she approached the final exit, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. Before she could react, a security guard lunged at her from the darkness. His hand struck like a viper, knocking the phone from her grasp. It skidded across the floor, the screen cracking as it came to a halt near the base of the staircase. "Got you," the guard sneered, his voice dripping with malice. He grabbed her roughly, twisting her arms behind her back. Ella winced, the pain shooting through her wrists as she struggled against his iron grip. "Let me go," she screamed, her voice echoing through the empty halls. She kicked and thrashed, but the guard was too strong. He dragged her back toward the living room, where Mary stood waiting, a cruel smile playing on her lips. Mary picked up the shattered phone, holding it up like a trophy. "You thought you were smart, didn't you?" she taunted, her voice laced with venom. With one swift motion, she slammed the phone against the edge of the table, the screen shattering into pieces. She stomped on it repeatedly, grinding the remnants under her heel until nothing but a pile of broken glass and metal remained. "Now you have nothing," Mary said, her laughter echoing through the room. "Tie her up." The guards dragged Ella to a chair, binding her hands and feet with coarse rope. The fibers bit into her skin, but she refused to cry out. She glared at Mary, her eyes blazing with defiance. "You're pathetic, Mary," Ella spat. "You think destroying the phone will save you? The truth always comes out." Mary's smile faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, her expression hardening. "You're the one who's pathetic, a nobody trying to play hero. You'll rot in jail for this." Ella leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Do you really think I'd come here without a backup plan? You're not as clever as you think, Mary." Mary's eyes narrowed, a flicker of doubt crossing her face. "What are you talking about?" Before Ella could respond, the sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with each passing second. Mary's face went pale, her confidence crumbling as the reality of the situation hit her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "This can't be happening." The front door burst open, and a swarm of police officers stormed into the mansion, their voices booming as they shouted orders. "Freeze! Nobody move!" Mary stumbled back, her hands trembling as she raised them in surrender. The guards, realizing the game was up, immediately released Ella and stepped back, their hands in the air. Ella stood, rubbing her sore wrists, a triumphant smile on her face. "I told you the truth would come out." Mary's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of rage, not remorse. "You'll pay for this," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. One of the officers approached Ella, his expression stern but kind. "Are you okay, miss?" Ella nodded, her voice steady. "I'm fine. The evidence you need is on Mr. Richard's computer. It's all there." The officer nodded, signaling to his team to secure the scene. Mr. Richard, who had been watching the chaos unfold from the doorway, stepped forward, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "You can't just barge into my home like this." The officer turned to him, his expression unyielding. "Mr. Richard, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit perjury. We have evidence that implicates you and your daughter in a false accusation against James Wilson." Mr. Richard's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the weight of the situation settled over him. This is a mistake," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Mary, now in handcuffs, turned to her father, her eyes pleading. "Daddy, do something? Don't let them take me." But Mr. Richard could only stare at her, his heart breaking as the reality of her lies came crashing down around them. "What have you done, Mary?" he whispered, his voice filled with despair. As the officers led Mary and Mr. Richard out of the mansion, Ella watched from the doorway, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over her. She had done it. She had exposed the truth and cleared James's name. But the cost had been high, and the scars of the battle would linger for a long time. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. James sat at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His face was drawn, the weight of the past 3 years etched into every line. Beside him, Ella sat, her presence a steadying force. The judge cleared his throat, the room falling silent as all eyes turned to him. After reviewing the evidence and considering all the arguments presented, he began, his voice heavy with gravity. "This court finds James Wilson not guilty of all charges." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a wave of murmurs. James's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down his face as the weight of the false accusation was finally lifted. Ella reached over, squeezing his hand. "It's over, James," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. "You're free." But the victory was bittersweet. As James stood to leave the courtroom, he caught sight of Mary and Mr. Richard, seated at the prosecution's table. Mary's face was pale, her eyes downcast, while Mr. Richard looked as though he had aged a decade in the span of a few weeks. The judge turned to them, his expression stern. "Mary Richards and Richard Richards, you have been found guilty of perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment. You will serve a sentence of 10 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Mary's face crumpled, her sobs echoing through the courtroom as the officers led her away. Mr. Richard followed, his head bowed in shame. As James and Ella stepped out of the courtroom, they were met with a barrage of reporters, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. "Mr. Wilson, how does it feel to be exonerated?" one reporter shouted. James paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It feels like a weight has been lifted," he said, his voice steady. "But the scars of what happened will always be with me. I just hope that my story can serve as a reminder that the truth will always come to light, no matter how hard someone tries to bury it." Ella stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "And I hope it's a reminder that there are still people willing to fight for justice, no matter the cost." The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. James moved into a new home, a modest but comfortable house far from the memories of the Richards mansion. Ella was a constant presence, helping him adjust to his newfound freedom and rebuild his life. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James turned to Ella, his expression serious. "Ella, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. You risked so much to help me, and I'll never be able to repay you." Ella smiled, her eyes soft with affection. "You don't have to repay me, James. Seeing you free and happy is all the thanks I need." James reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You've been my rock through all of this. I don't know where I'd be without you." Ella's heart swelled with emotion. "You'd have found a way, James. You're stronger than you think." James shook his head. "No, ella. It's because of you that I'm here. You believed in me when no one else did. You fought for me when everyone else turned their backs. I love you, Ella." Ella's breath caught in her throat, her eyes wide with surprise. "James, I know it's sudden," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "And I understand if you don't feel the same way. But I needed to tell you. You've given me a second chance at life, and I want to spend that life with you." Tears filled Ella's eyes as she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. "I love you too, James. I think I have for a long time." James's heart soared as he pulled her into a tight embrace, the weight of the past finally lifting. For the first time in years, he felt hope, real, unshakable hope. The story of James and Ella became a symbol of resilience and justice. Their love story, born out of betrayal and hardship, inspired many. As for Mary and Mr. Richard, they served their time, but their reputations were forever tarnished. James and Ella, on the other hand, thrived. They built a life together, proving that even in the darkest of times, love and truth could prevail. And as they stood hand in hand, watching the sunset from their porch, they knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Which country are you watching from? Please don't forget to like and subscribe.